Bonjour tout le monde. Hi everyone. This is the sound we were hoping for. Chatter and excitement and people sharing ideas. This is absolutely fabulous. Fabulous. Since you've all been very busy, I'm going to ask, I know that Sandy's back. Is she in the room? Sandy Baumgartner? Where are you, Sandy? Thank you for last night. I think it would be just... It was a fully activated venue, the way we love to see it. I know that Sandy and I have been friends for years. We've known each other, we've collaborated, we've sat on boards together. And her dream for this conference was to share the most we could possibly share with you about Saskatchewan. And I just wanted to give you a few little tidbits of information to take home of things that you probably do not know. Saskatchewan is the site of North America's oldest bird sanctuary. Do you know where that is? Last Mountain Lake, established in 1887. We have, Saskatchewan has nearly how many lakes? Over 100,000 lakes. You are correct. Where are the largest active sand dunes in Canada? Athabasca sand dunes. You are correct. Yeah, he's not allowed to speak. Is that it? Name the lake where name the Saskatchewan lake where the specific gravity of the water is greater than the Dead Sea, and where it is impossible to sink. Lake Manitou. And there's a great legend about this lake. You'll have to look it up. You'll always remember. Little facts about Saskatchewan. Well, today's panel, entitled Bridging, Braiding, Weaving Indigenous Science with Western Science, would not have been possible without the incredible support of our presenting sponsor for the conference, Environment Climate Change Canada. I'd like to invite Paul McDonald from the Indigenous Science Division of ECCC, the presenting sponsor of the entire conference and this panel, to say a few words. Paul.
Danzi, Wache, Ulukut, good morning. I am the Director of Environment Climate Change Canada's Indigenous Science Division, which is a fairly new division at Environment and Climate Change Canada, established about 2 years ago. The Indigenous Science Division is an Indigenous employee-led team at ECCC. We are based on bridging, braiding, and weaving as our framework for how we built the team and also how we promote Indigenous science within the department. And I'm very excited, as you can imagine, to hear the other examples from the panel that we're about to hear from today. For Environment and Climate Change Canada, it's a science-based department, and the Indigenous Science Division ensures that the Indigenous science not only complements but also enhances the more traditional science programs of the department to inform all programs and policies across the department's mandate, so things like clean air, clean water, biodiversity, weather prediction, climate change, so a broad scope of things that are important and identified as community priorities as well. At the base of all this work, very complex, but at the base, relationships. And within the federal family, we do participate on an interdepartmental Indigenous STEM cluster. There's about 14 other departments and agencies that come together and share challenges and opportunities about applying that Indigenous science lens and Indigenous perspectives into all the programs and policies, the challenges within a Government of Canada working environment has its own unique challenges. So we come together, so we have kind of our own community there. More broadly, to advance our collective understanding of Indigenous science, I think it's important to create these kind of spaces for bringing people together to talk about Indigenous science, sharing examples and challenges of your own from different perspectives. So I think personally, for the past couple of days, through the ceremonies, through the on-land experiences, the discussions, the panels, the side conversations, including last night, I feel I understand Saskatchewan a lot better than I did. This is my first time coming to Saskatchewan. I formed a connection, obviously, with the place and the people. So I'll be taking this back to Labrador when I return home, and this will be part of me when I'm thinking about how we advance Indigenous science. I hope that each of you has something that you can bring back home with you as well. You're not done, though. Maintain and build those connections. And not to get ahead of ourselves for today either. We're not done yet. Obviously, there's a full day of learning opportunities and more opportunities for connections and talking to each other today. So let's not skip over that part. It's very important that we appreciate these times that we can come together in person. So with that, I'll happily pass the mic back. You can introduce our panel for us. Enjoy the rest of the day, everyone, particularly this panel presentation. Miigwech Nakamik.
We had thank you very much, Paul. I mean, your contribution to the success of this conference will be carried for many, many years, certainly days and weeks and months to come, for the impact that this conference is having on everyone's life today. I would have loved to introduce a wonderful lady who has been personally instrumental in my reconciliation journey and my greater understanding of Indigenous-led research. Unfortunately, Laurie Campbell, VP of Indigenous Engagement at the Regina University, was supposed to moderate the panel this morning, and she's not able to join us. She sends her regrets from the Vancouver airport, I believe, which we've all had to deal with since the last few years. But we have a wonderful group of panelists this morning that are here. And we have Andrea and Jennifer, I'm so sorry, who will be leading the conversation. So I would like to invite our panelists to join us on stage. We have Andrea Lafont, CEO of Meewasin Valley Authority. We have Yin Natovich, Resource Manager for Management Coordinator at Waniskewan. We have Don Pratt, founder and CEO of Askinotau STEM, and Jennifer Franks, Director of Indigenous Relations at the Toronto Zoo. Thank you.
There we go. I think I'm kicking us off.
Yeah.
All right, so thank you, Claire. I can't quite see you, but thank you for the introductions here. I know a very big part that we've certainly heard throughout the conference is the importance of connection to make that meaningful impact within environment and climate change. And so sharing who we are and what community we are from is an important part of that. So I'll start with myself, and then I'll turn it over to everybody here. So my name is Andrea Lafond. As you can see, I'm the CEO for Meewasin Valley Authority, but I am a registered citizen with the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan. I am diverse, so I have the Métis background, but I'm also German and Welsh, and so I like to take pride in all aspects of me as I work with a connected community back home on our priorities and goals. And I just want to invite everyone else to introduce yourselves and share a bit more of who you are.
Sure. Tanse, I'm Jennifer Franks, Director of Indigenous Relations at Toronto Zoo. I am a Red River Métis woman. I'm a member of the Manitoba Métis Federation, a registered citizen. I've lived in Toronto for just over 20 years, but I'm not from Ontario. I'm actually a Western girl. I was born in Calgary. My family roots are in Red River, obviously, now known as Winnipeg. But we migrated from there to Birch Hills, which is just south of Prince Albert. So that's where my Métis family roots are really grounded. And also in Lac La Biche, Alberta, and in Prince Rupert, British Columbia, which is where my father is from. So I'm a mother to two teenagers, 13 and 16. And yeah, I have a background in community development and urban planning, and worked a lot in policy, and then started working really closely with urban Indigenous community in Toronto on placemaking initiatives, which then led me to the Toronto Zoo. And I'll just leave it at that for now.
I'm going to try and avoid using the microphone. I think it might blow some eardrums. Tanzi, Katav and Scott Noa. Hello, everyone. My name is Ian Natowich. As it says, I'm the Resource Management Coordinator for the Wanuskewin Heritage Park. I started working there just about 2 years ago, and I have thoroughly enjoyed the experience. And yeah, anytime I get the opportunity to talk about the grasslands in particular and how all of our work in the grasslands ends up making those places a healthier landscape for all future generations, I'm pretty excited to do so. So I'm very happy to be here today.
Hi, I'm Dawn Pratt. I'm actually from Treaty 4 here. I'm from, my father's from Muscopine Anishinaabe First Nation, and my mother's from the George Gordon First Nation, both located on Treaty 4, not far from Regina. So I was born and raised here. I currently live in Treaty 6 in Saskatoon right now, and I've been there for, I don't know, maybe 15 years since I moved there to do my Master's of Science in Chemistry at the University of Saskatchewan, and I just love Saskatoon so much, I wanted to stay there. And I created, as it says, my company name is ASCII Nutau STEM Enterprise, and I focus on, indigenizing, bringing science, infusing Indigenous knowledge and science in the classroom and the curriculum. Thank you.
Thank you. So I have a next question. So could everyone share a little bit about the path which led you to where you are now? And maybe I'll go last. So I'll start with you, Andrea, and then Ian, and then Dawn.
All right. So do we have Blue Bus folks in the room?
Yes. Blue Bus.
So you'll hear some consistent messages, so I'm sorry if I'm re-saying that. But my kind of professional background is what's called a CAFM designation through AFOA Canada. So this is finance and governance focused with a kind of a First Nations lens to that, as well as HR and a few other components within that. And I have a past history prior to arriving at Meewasin Valley Authority. I spent 5 years at Wanuskewin Heritage Park as their CFO. Saskatchewan Indian Institute of Technologies, which I mentioned on the bus, is well over 50 years old as a First Nations governed post-secondary institute. Same goes for Gabriel Dumont Institute, which is a Métis governed organization where I also worked. So I take a lot of my learning through who I am through a lot of those experiences and the different interactions that I have through both governments, First Nations, Métis, provincial, federal, and then also through community, and as I've worked through them. So it's always been my job to ensure organizations are sustainable, stretch goals, and that I do that very collectively with the diverse community that exists today. And I have just, heartfelt desire to see really positive economic impact for First Nations and Métis on the land.
Thank you. Ian? Dawn?
My path, you want me to share? Yeah. Well, of course, I went to school, and I have your traditional education system that I went through, but the journey to get from where that education to where I am now was quite the path, and wasn't something I could find in the textbook, nor was it anything I could find in a science center or a science classroom. Really, it involved working with communities, working with youth, working with our elders and our Indigenous knowledge holders, and creating some kind of Indigenous infusion into the classroom, into the science classroom, and it really just started with my own personal flair on how do I think Indigenous teachings and knowledge should be taught in the classroom. But not only that, I also had to tie it to the curriculum, because our schools in the First Nation communities have to follow the provincial curriculum. So that was one of the big challenges for our educators, especially when a lot of them are challenged with, not even really liking science was a big issue. But so not even liking science, not really understanding the scientific concepts themselves. And then so when I came into the classroom, I would bridge the two and show the teachers how I did. But it was really just my own personal preference from what I was listening to in the communities when I was working with communities. What was important to the communities, it was all this knowledge that I was listening to was how I started to develop where I went, and that's where I am today, in short.
So my story really starts coming right out of high school. I jumped to the University of Saskatchewan for my first year of education, or higher education, and I did tremendously bad. I came out of my first year with, I believe, a 63% average. And being the son of a university professor, that was a bit shameful. So I decided that maybe school wasn't for me. So I jumped out of school and I worked as a lifeguard for about 4 years. Before that, started getting pretty tiresome. I was talking with my mother, who relayed a story about one of her past students coming to talk to her, and just telling her how much she'd been enjoying her new career, and giving the example of her and her team had been spending about 3 or 4 days catching frogs in a pond so that they could relocate those frogs to another pond to allow the development of a pipeline. And my first thought was, I would love to get paid to catch frogs. So I decided that maybe my avenue towards that was going back to school, so I jumped into renewable resource management at the University of Saskatchewan. I followed that up with a master's degree in soil science, where my focus was on ecological restoration of disturbed low Arctic tundra communities. So I got to go up to a mine site in northern Canada and try to get plants to grow in the Arctic, which I'm sure some of you can imagine is a relatively slow process. So after I defended my thesis, I found myself at Wanuskewin just about a week afterwards. So it was a pretty quick transition, and I've just been enjoying the job ever since.
Awesome. So for myself, I went to university in Vancouver, and I got a bachelor degree in sociology and anthropology. And then from there, I did a master's in community and regional planning and urban planning. And so I've always been very interested in the whole concept of place and space and our human connection to space and how we sort of interact with the spaces in which we live, and how those spaces and places connect with cultural and spiritual and other aspects of our communities and of our lives. So I've always had that interest, but my professional career has been working a lot in policy. So I worked in the government sector for quite a long time, province of Ontario and the city of Toronto, working mostly in policy, corporate policy, but always maintaining a very strong and active role within the urban Indigenous community in Toronto. There's a very big urban Indigenous population in Toronto, upwards of 100,000 First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. So there's a very interesting multi-layers of engagement and working with community. From there, I started working with the Indigenous Affairs Office in the City of Toronto, working primarily on placemaking and placekeeping initiatives with communities. So park design, integrating Indigenous design principles into new city development, integrating more language, so Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee languages into some of our park spaces, and opening up access to space within the parks and ravine system in the city for community to come and do ceremony, cultural programming, which, especially COVID shone a very bright light on the need for everyone to have access, more access to green space. But for a lot of the folks that live in Toronto that are First Nations, Inuit, or Métis, they don't have access to land for ceremony and cultural programming, cultural work. So, and so part of that was also working internally on barriers to community for accessing those spaces, and I think the word decolonize is used a lot. It's starting to kind of, I feel, lose its meaning a little bit, but decolonizing processes and policies within the city. And then I moved to the Toronto Zoo. There was a job that came up in Indigenous relations, which was a new position, and the zoo really started going on the journey of looking at its relationship to the land it's on. So it sits on 500 acres of pretty pristine, about as pristine as you're going to get in an urban setting, of Carolinian forest within the Rouge National Urban Park. And then just its role, and I'll get into this a little bit in a further question, but role as a zoo, and caretaking many species of animals, and then our conservation science work, both in situ, so that's in the communities where the animals, the species are from, and ex situ, so within the zoo. And I really felt that that would be a great opportunity to blend my personal interest, obviously, in connection with land and the Indigenous connection with Mother Earth and our animal relatives, but also my policy background as well. So that's a little bit about my journey.
Thank you. All right, so to everybody here, what gaps did you see within your fields, and how are you bringing in Indigenous knowledge to help fill those?
I just spoke, so I'll hand it over to Dawn. What was the question? I couldn't really hear you.
Okay, what types of gaps did you see within your field, and how are you bringing in Indigenous knowledge to help fill them?
Gaps did we see? Oh, gaps. Oh, there was a lot of gaps I saw. Everywhere I went, in the classroom, the teacher's experience with trying to make science fun, hands-on, and engaging. The curriculum, there's lots of gaps in the curriculum. There's lots of gaps in the content, the way it's delivered. There was gaps in the science centers. When I go to science centers, I was questioning, why is the buffalo and the teepee in a museum when it should be in a science center to me, right? And where's our elders and knowledge keepers? Why are we in this textbook? Like, they take some of our concepts or our teachings and they put their own scientific terminology on it. And I thought that, well, the ecology, like the topic of ecologies, that the elders teach about ecology and how everything is connected through our biosphere and our hydrosphere. The elders will teach you about how everything's connected. So when I look at ecology, I'm like, well, where's the acknowledgement of our elders in this textbook? So that there was no textbooks acknowledging they take our teachings and put their own twist on them, and that's how I saw textbooks when I would look at them, and I just really thought, wow, there's a big gap in our education system, and I thought it was really important that this needed to be brought out and shown to our youth that are learning science right now, because a lot of them are like, science isn't for me. No, it's like, science is for you. Like, our ancestors, this is our ancestors' knowledge and their legacy, and there's a lot of connections and intersections I can see in the curriculum when I hear an elder teaching. It may be just so subtle, and then I may be, reading something in the curriculum or come across a document, and I'll be just blown away by, like, I can't believe I'm the only one that sees this connection and this gap in our education system. So I see a lot of gaps. I believe, like, there's a lot of ways to go, but I just, nobody else was really. I've been in science myself my whole education career for over 20 years, and nothing has really changed in the reserves. And I thought, in the reserve schools, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to do something because nobody else is doing anything about it. So I decided I'm going to start my own science-based company and have it focused on Indigenous knowledge and teachings, and listen to our elders and try and infuse this into the curriculum. And I was thinking, well, how am I going to compete with all these huge science organizations? But I was able to compete because I was able to set myself apart and be able to bring this different perspective or this different lens on how science is taught, how we think of science in general. Even myself, I have a hard time. Sometimes I get stuck in that narrow tunnel of science, and then I have to pull myself out of it and go, no, like, there's other ways to connect this and teach this in the classroom. And this is what the elders teach it about. This is the concept that they're talking about in the classroom. So yeah, I see a lot of educational gaps, and we have a long ways. And I creating a path, and I took a step in a direction that there is no path. There's no textbooks for me. Everything's out of my own mind or my own readings or my own interactions when I'm in community, working with knowledge keepers, working with language keepers, working with the community experts, and that's my classroom. I can't learn what I learn in a university. I can't learn it in a science class. I have to learn it on my own in community when I get that, when I'm, to me, I think it's a luxury when I get to sit in community or sit with an elder. That's a luxury to me. So when I get that chance, I'm very, in tune, and I'm always listening to what the elders and knowledge keepers and they all say. And sometimes, you can't process stuff like that right away. It takes, it could take a year, it could take a couple years to finally one day it'll click and go, oh, okay, this is what they're talking about in the classroom and this in the curriculum. So yeah, there's a lot of education gaps, and we're just beginning that path.
I think quite similarly. The gaps that I see are predominantly how we talk about Indigenous knowledge and Western science. And I think I've had a bit of a backwards approach to this to some of my other panelists, because I am not Indigenous myself. And all of my background was strictly Western science. Now, I was studying in ecological fields, so traditional ecological knowledge was something that we often talked about. But when we were talking about it throughout my education, it was more often, it felt as though we were talking about two different subjects. We would talk about what the Western science told us about a particular situation, and then we would talk about traditional knowledge. And oftentimes, those examples were given as if they were often contradictory, or these two forms of knowledge were antagonistic towards each other. And so, starting work at Wanuskewin and recognizing that my purely Western science perspective was, at best disingenuous to use at Wanuskewin, such a sacred landscape, that I started immersing myself in as much of that traditional knowledge as I possibly could. So I tried to speak with our elders as much as I could. I tried to speak with other workers at Wanuskewin. My apologies, I spilled water all over the place. The more and more I started to do that, the more and more I started to recognize that understanding of these two different forms of knowledge being two different subjects is entirely wrong. And the more I started to recognize things at Wanuskewin, and the more I was told by our elders, I started to recognize that they aren't two different subjects, they're merely two different interpretations of the exact same data set. So again, I work in an ecological world. So when we talk about those pieces of knowledge from both forms of traditional knowledge and Western science, we're talking about observations of the exact same phenomena. And the only difference between the two is the interpretation of that observation. So since I've started working at Wanuskewin, I have found very, very few points where Western science and Indigenous knowledge contradict each other or are antagonistic towards each other. I have found far more opportunities where traditional knowledge allows me to use Western science in a particular way, or Western science allows me to figure out opportunities where I can revert and incorporate more of that cultural custom. So I think one thing that is really important is changing up how we talk about those two forms of knowledge. We need to make that distinction, that they are not different. It is simply a different interpretation. It is simply viewing that same exact information through a different lens. And I think when we come to that recognition, it's so much easier to find those opportunities where we can merge traditional knowledge and Western science together.
So I work in a zoo, which I think I'm the only person here that works in a zoo, but maybe I'm not. So zoos are inherently colonial. I mean, let's face it, when they were first their history goes back to, when rich people would go and basically take animals out of the wild and bring them back to Europe, wherever they're from, and have them as their own personal menagerie. And things have evolved and changed. Obviously, over the years, they've become more, focused on education. And now there's more and more of a conservation angle to zoos and aquariums. And that tends to be, a lot of the driving raison d'etre, I guess, for zoos. And yes, there are still animals in captivity, but there's a conscious, very purposeful, thoughtful kind of, species that we have that live in our care. They're there as ambassadors for their relatives in the wild. And so as far as gaps in the field, I just wanted to start with that because I just wanted to kind of say, we have to face the fact that zoos will never be decolonized because it's just their very nature is that. But the work that we do, so there's obviously a lot of gaps. There's a lot of layers to it. So, I think that with my work, there's the work on the site itself. And so when I see gaps, I see, there's been gaps in telling the stories of the animals in our care. They're all obviously Indigenous to somewhere. And the animals that are in our care that are Indigenous to Turtle Island, we do a really good job in our interpretive elements of talking about their migratory patterns and what they eat and, sort of that piece. But we haven't done a good job, and I think it's changing slowly, but a good job in really connecting them to who they are and their connection to communities and people and that spiritual, cultural, economic sustenance, those connections, and connecting that with language as well. Because as we know, language is so important, and it really communicates more than just words. It's a worldview. And then with our conservation programs, which we have developed many sort of signature conservation programs over the years, Eastern Massasauga rattlesnake, we work with communities in Alberta and Saskatchewan, I think University of Saskatchewan and U of A, on a bison biobanking program. And Eastern Massasauga rattlesnake and Northern boreal caribou. There's a few other local keystone species that we've been working over the years with partnering with First Nations and educational institutions and so on. And it's getting better, but historically, the plan's been developed, and then talking to the First Nations or partnering with First Nations has always been an afterthought, or something that comes kind of, partway through the whole process. So we're looking to change that, and we have an opportunity with a new program, our Boreal Caribou program, where we're working closely with a First Nation in Hudson Bay, Winnisk First Nation, which is one of the Mushkegowuk Cree communities, before there's even any real talk about the sort of the field work, is getting to know the community and spending that time to build those relationships, and get to know a little bit about the community's connection to the species, their animal relative, and find out, to the extent that they want to share, what their cultural, spiritual connection is, how they feel about folks from outside the community coming onto their territory and studying their animal relatives, touching their animal relatives. And so these are processes which I think are, kind of new, at least in the last little while, of taking that time and listening and giving that space and shifting basically control, and I don't want to say power. Power is not the right word, but where the First Nations are at least equal partners, if not have more say. And certainly when we go on their territory, they have complete say. There's nothing's to say that they might not say, we're not interested in working with you. There's a lot of assumptions made that, of course, the First Nations, are going to want to work with us and going to save the, caribou or save, and it's like, well, maybe that's not their priority, and maybe they don't want to work with us. And so there's a lot of arrogance, I think there has been historically. I think that's changing, but it's still systemically still sort of there. So we're looking to kind of take a different approach to that as well. So just starting with those basic questions and building relationships, and I'll leave it at that.
Okay, so I'll share a little bit about the gaps. Certainly when I arrived at Meewasin Valley Authority, and I say that word because it is on paper, it's a colonial construct, right? So we have provincial, city, and university governance. It wasn't long into going for truck rides with Rennie, I think folks remember him, where I got to travel through the valley. And of course, my reaction was like, oh boy, do I ever need to get our First Nations and Métis partners involved and create space and opportunity for them. And although everything is always urgent, it was really important. I remember going home, sitting at the table with my kids, talking about what I was learning, and I said, what if we, took an eagle-eye view of the valley, and what if we talked about the next 100 years? Because folks know Raymond Moriyama. Maybe I'll just let folks give a big clap for him. So although the organization was a colonial construct, there was quite a visionary document called the 100-Year Plan, where it took into consideration all of these important relationships to land dating back centuries. So I sat with my kids at the table, and I said, if we were eagles and we were above the valley, like what would it look like if everybody actually, started to work together, and what could that look like? And I did a smudge. I still remember it was a Wednesday in July, and my son was like, well, you should be partnering with folks as far as Batoche and Whitecap and all these, coming up with all these really beautiful visions. And I went, well, I'm brand new in my job, so if I walked this vision into my board, they're either going to support me or they're going to think I'm crazy. So right after that smudge, I opened up my email. For some reason, something told me to do that, and I had a beautiful email from architect Raymond Moriyama, who congratulated me in my role, told me I'm going to have some beautiful times, I'm going to have fights, tremendous successes, but to keep going. So he was reflecting back on his time when he got to explore the rich culture and nature throughout the river valley, and that made me take a big, brave breath, pick up the phone to my board chair and say, hey, I think we need to be starting to think in this way about how we could be more inclusive, how the economy could thrive, all of these really interesting pieces. And he said, I will stand by you. And I think at the time there was an ask through ECCC for some vision around some of these pieces, and I remember working with a gentleman named Dr. Harvey Locke on some of this vision to help start to paint that picture of what we could create by including our First Nations and Métis, federal government into Meewasin, all these wonderful things I brought together what a path forward would look like to my board, and it was passed immediately. Now with that, it's okay, so slow and steady, and how do we get there? And Wanuskewin is a significant partner in Meewasin. It was one of the first sites that Meewasin secured. It's got a very similar governance structure, but an FSIN seat and a Meewasin seat. So it was an act towards reconciliation ahead of that becoming a word, and ahead of calls to action and such, which I'm so very honored to have had that opportunity to work there. But at the time when Wanuskewin was created and Meewasin had been created, it was like, okay, they'll go over there and they'll do their piece with First Nations, and we'll be over here just loving the nature and environment. And so another really important piece was to bring together the two teams of Meewasin and Wanuskewin, because Wanuskewin needs to talk about the environment and Meewasin needs to include reconciliation. So that was another really big piece that I would say was definitely embraced across the operational teams to start to work together in collaboration, and I know we'll certainly share with that. And then into looking at the decision making of Meewasin, how do we get First Nation and Métis representation on our board when we're making decisions about land? And we're proud to report that yes, we have that inclusion today, making sure. We also had the rural municipality of Corman Park, so it wasn't, when I was looking at inclusion, it wasn't just First Nation and Métis, it's like, where did we step a little sideways in the creation to be able to do that? And then having a ton of space. So you talked about how there's not a lot of space. We had a ton of space. So we're really endeavoring into creating Indigenous-led opportunities where we can throughout the valley, and forming those partnerships as we go. So, yeah.
Thank you. So I actually have, the next question is for you, Andrea. So Andrea, can you share a story about processes and protocols for collaborations with Indigenous communities?
Yeah, so I'll kind of work through a couple different projects and how I went about doing those. So as we are doing a national urban park exploration, of course, naturally our funding governing partners are at the table with the federal government, but really understanding, and that's really through my years of work and learning, was we needed to include Métis and First Nations at the table, understanding those governance structures. So right at the onset, I went directly to, we're Saskatchewan, our FSIN. I said, here's the laydown of the project, who should be representing that? And through that process, they said, Saskatoon Tribal Council, and I did the same thing with the Métis Nation, and through that process, it was someone from the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan and someone from the local area. So understanding those, how those governance structures work are really vital, and to the type of project. So this one here is looking at a national designation. It's looking at land decision making. So that was critically important. On the flip side, when we get into in our Canadian Prairies Prescribed Fire Exchange and developing in partnership Indigenous-led relationship to fire curriculum, working with those different language groups who have worked and have actual history within fire and the different language groups. So it was less about going through the governance structure and much more about the relationships that we had established and what those experiences were of those knowledge keepers, elders, and actually practitioners that are on the land today, be it fighting fires or teaching those things. So it's really I don't know how each province is governed or exists, but really understanding how to find the right people to make your project successful.
Oh, thank you. I think you have the next question.
And is this video time? Are we going straight
I'll speak
there?
to it. Yeah.
Okay, so we're hoping that you can share the value of braiding epistemologies, I probably didn't say that right, and making space for ceremony within your work.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I think earlier, a lot of the work that we do is very multi-layered because we have, the site itself and all of the work that we do, which is also multi-layered, but then we have our work with communities outside of the zoo, particularly in our conservation science programs. So focusing on the conservation science work with First Nations in particular, I mentioned, building those relationships is so important, and ensuring that space is made for ceremony as part of those programs. And so what that looks like is really not up to us, it depends on the community. So we spend time spending time with the community, making efforts to try to understand their connection with the animal relatives, and making space for community to guide how they want to be involved. So, where do they want ceremony to be as part of the process? Whether that's, and it depends on the nature of the initiative, so it could be at any point, and it's flexible, obviously. That's totally driven by the community. Also, it's not really ceremonial, but it's part of kind of our relationship building is protocols and establishing protocols with the community. Protocols being, anything from how we, cultural protocols, to protocols around information sharing, data sharing, the principles of OCAP, which I don't know if anyone's spoken to that. Yeah, so First Nations ownership, collection, access, and possession. And typically that's been sort of utilized working with First Nations on data associated with the community itself. So, statistical information around health and, but we're looking to apply principles of OCAP to collection of actual, biological material and working with communities. So what does that look like? Like when the zoo and our conservation partners work with the First Nation and there's, some eastern Massasauga rattlesnakes that are collected as part of that breeding program, there's knowledge and there's stories as part of that process. And so, who owns that? Obviously the First Nation, but these protocols need to be kind of explicitly discussed and talked about, and if necessary, written down, because otherwise, we have run into some issues after the fact. I know with the rattlesnake program, there was concerns with one of the First Nations that they didn't know where their relatives went. Their snakes were taken. They were brought to our facility, obviously very well looked after, but the First Nations community didn't know that, and they didn't know where their progeny went. Their progeny were released into the wild as part of a species survival plan, but the First Nation didn't know. And so that was a huge issue, right? So breaking down that trust. So so that's part of the ceremony and part of the protocols that we've been sort of working on the site. It's part of our celebrating the animals in our care and talking about their stories. There's also a component of staff health and well-being. Obviously working in an environment like the zoo where especially our keeping staff become extremely close to the animals that they look after. They develop relationships, and some of those relationships are built over 10, 20 years. So when an animal passes away, it is very emotionally it's very, it's very sad, and it creates a lot of just mental health concerns, compassion fatigue, and all of those things. So we started looking at ceremony when our animals are needing to pass on to the spirit world. And so we started looking at doing some ceremony, particularly with species that are native to Turtle Island. So we had an American bald eagle. His name was Jade. He was 40 years old, and he passed away. So as a staff group, we had a small ceremony for him. We gave him a cedar bath and, sang songs to send him back to the spirit world, smudged. And that was very well received by staff. And so a bit later on, one of our grizzly bears, Samson was 25 years old. He was from Tsimshian territory, so sort of southern Alaska, northern British Columbia. He was an orphaned cub, so he lived pretty much his whole life at the zoo. He was obviously very beloved, iconic, charismatic animal. We had some elders come every year for probably about 15 years to feast Samson and his partner Shinte, another grizzly bear. Just before they hibernated, they would come and offer food and sort of send them on their winter sleep. So there's already some good connections being built with community and Shinte and Samson. But when Samson woke up from his hibernation in 2023, he was extremely arthritic. He basically couldn't walk. And so, our vet staff tried everything to try to make him more comfortable. Worked for a little bit, but clearly, a decision needs to be made at some point around his well-being. So it was decided to put him to sleep, to send him on his journey. So we had a little bit of time to kind of plan on a ceremony for Samson. So he was put to sleep on a Monday. This was in April of 2023. And we had arranged a Tsimshian knowledge keeper and an Anishinaabe knowledge keeper to hold ceremony for Samson. So he passed away, and he was kept in a space where he could be kept fresh for a couple of days. And then we, down in our lower bison paddock, the only day in April of 2023 when there was actual sun, the rest of the month it was cold and rainy, over 150 staff and volunteers from our zoo, some members of Indigenous community in Toronto and First Nations that are close to the zoo came and held ceremony for Samson. So we had a pipe ceremony, we had a sharing circle, we gave him a cedar bath, and we also made Samson a spirit plate so that he can eat while he's on his journey back home. And I have a 20-second video of the ceremony, so I would just like to show it. I don't know if someone can hit play. There we go. This is obviously sped up. Thank you. I'll leave it at that.
Ian, did you want to share as well a bit about how you incorporate ceremony into your work?
Yeah. So I'm sure many of you who came out to Wanuskewin are familiar, but when I first started working in Wanuskewin, one of my first courses of action was to go to our Elders Council and ask if there was anything in particular that they wanted me to do as part of my job on the landscape. And they told me a great number of things. However, the one request that they asked me was to ensure that any time I am about to disturb or impact the landscape in any way whatsoever, to lay down an offering of tobacco. And so that has now become a daily part of my activities, certainly during the growing season, for really anything we do, whether it is cutting out a single plant of absinthe, or whether it is starting a prescribed fire, we are always giving a tobacco offering. And I've become, that's now become something that is quite possibly my favorite part of the job. Not only do I feel like having that opportunity to directly address and talk to the landscape that I'm working on allows the development of that really deep personal connection that I have with that landscape. But it also offers me this wonderful 30-second moment of reflection where I get to truly and genuinely ask myself, do I need to input myself into this situation? Do I need to make an impact on the landscape? Or can I stand back and can I let nature go off on its own devices? And so I've thoroughly enjoyed those tobacco offerings. And for those of you who came out to Wanuskewin, I try and encourage everybody that comes out to the site to also have that opportunity of giving a tobacco offering back. And so I don't just do that with tour groups, I do that with really anybody that I interact with on the landscape. And one of my favorite stories comes from our first prescribed fire at Wanuskewin. So we had about 25 people and just an outrageous amount of machinery and equipment ready to go to make sure that our first prescribed fire in 8 years was done successfully and without incident. So with help from Meewasin Valley Authority and the Canadian Prairies Prescribed Fire Exchange, we had a fantastic fire. There was no issues with it whatsoever, and we got a nice 10.8 acre burn unit. So before that burn, I had gone to our elders and asked if there was anything in specific they would like me to do. And again, they just told me to make sure that I give a tobacco offering. So a few minutes beforehand, I had gone to a nearby bison rubbing stone and given my own offering tobacco. I thought it was a bit strange that I be the only one out of these 30-some participants to do so. So I offered everybody that was there the opportunity to join me in giving an offering. And I was really just overwhelmed to see that all of our fire participants, including the film crew that we had hired to commemorate that burn, all took a moment aside and went off onto the landscape and gave their own private offering. So like I said, we had a gorgeous day. It was a fantastic burn. And after that, one of the participants on that burn came up to me, and they were clearly going through a pretty significant emotional event. And they just said thank you. And when I asked them what they were thanking me for, they just said for that opportunity to give the tobacco offering. And they later told me that it made them feel closer to the memory of their grandmother. Now, I think we can all agree that that's a pretty strong emotional experience, and I was really just overjoyed to hear that, because in my opinion, that is someone who is always going to be connecting, or personally connected, not just to that burn unit, not just to Wanuskewin in general, but to his family. And I think, knowledge is incredible. The information that we all have is what allows us to do the work that we do. However, knowledge is useless if you don't have a passion to use it. So when that personal connection is developed with the landscape, I think people are not only willing, but actually excited to come out onto the landscape and get their hands dirty. And I think just that opportunity to add in ceremony has thoroughly increased my enjoyment of my work and really driven home that personal connection that I have with that landscape.
Tom, did you want to share anything?
In regards to the ceremonies and the protocols that we learn from our elders, for me, I see it pretty similar to how the scientific method is implemented when we're experimenting and we're learning. I see that our ceremonies and protocols, they're much older. They're, thousands of years old as compared to the scientific method. So when I think about ceremonies and protocols and, how is that, connected to the curriculum, or how is that connected to science? And I see it that, science has its own protocols, its own methodology of, learning. And so our ceremonies and protocols are, specific ways to learn and teach ceremony, or just teach a topic from the elders. But I just wanted to add that.
Thank you. So I'm looking at the time. We want to give about 15 minutes at the end for questions. So I thought maybe what I would do is I would take question 7 on language.
Sure.
And then just so that we can talk a little bit about language, and then we can see what time we have left.
Yeah.
That works for you?
Yep.
Okay. So some of you have spoken about the importance of incorporating Indigenous language into your work. Could you share a little bit about that? How about you, Ian? Want to go first?
Absolutely. So again, I have the very lucky privilege that I do get to work alongside Wanuskewin's Elders Council. And our elders are, traditional Indigenous language speakers, and many of them I know in my discussions with them, there are points where they are clearly trying to tell me something, but English is not the right language to use. There is just the feelings and the overall message behind what they're trying to deliver to me can't really be appropriately described through English. And so I've come to realize that I think one of the best things that I could do to increase my ability and my efficiency at doing my own job is to start learning those Indigenous languages so that I can communicate more effectively with our elders. And so I started learning Cree, and I'll tell you right now, I've been having a tremendous difficulty with it. It is an incredible language, but one that is so entirely strange to me. And so I was starting to get a little bit disheartened just because I was having such trouble trying to get this, intro knowledge on how to speak Cree. And then in February, I happened to be at the Prairie Conservation Action Plan meeting in Saskatoon, where we had the privilege of Elder Duquette coming to speak to us. And he spoke about a great number of things, but one that really resonated with me was when he started talking about the importance of his language. And he said something that really inspired me to keep on going on that journey with learning how to speak Cree, which is, he was talking about his early education, and to quote him, he said, "I learned English so that I could speak to all of you. None of you have learned Cree so that you can speak to me." And so I thought that was particularly powerful, and that idea that here is an individual who has an incredible amount of information to share, and an incredible amount of knowledge to pass on to future generations. But there is this entire large subset of the population who are not willing to put in the same effort that he has put in to be able to deliver that information. Now, working at Wanuskewin, we, of course, try and put language into everything we do. There are, I believe, 9 different pre-contact Indigenous communities or cultures have been documented at Wanuskewin, and so there is an incredible amount of language just flying throughout the entire site. And again, it's one of those things that I feel has thoroughly increased my own passion for the work that I do, is being able to speak to our elders, how they had learned when they were children. And I think meeting them on that even playing field and showing that we are willing to put through the effort so that we can work together is just so critical for how we are able to actually function and complete the work we need to do.
Thanks. Dawn?
Language is one of the big priorities that I try and incorporate in the classroom when we're learning scientific concepts. A lot of our language has been suppressed. It's a little challenging to find, words for something, and there's not even a word for science, because I've asked. So, our language, our knowledge has been so suppressed, but we're slowly building it back. And so I'm always pushing language for, scientific terms in the classroom when we're teaching concepts like, earth, air, water, sun. We have words for those kind of science terms. And so I'm always trying to, science has its own language. There's scientific language. We have, plain language, and then we have, where, depending where I am, if I'm in a Cree community or a Anishinaabe community, they have different terms. They vary. So I'm always tracking down the Cree or Anishinaabe teachers in the schools, and asking, what are these? What words here? Do you have words for these science words that I want to teach in the classroom today? And so the students will learn. The students are not only, I feel like the students, you learn science, but then they have to pick it up a notch, and you're starting to learn at a different level now. You're not only learning scientific terminology, you're also learning, the Cree word for that term that the students have to learn about. So that's how I bring language into the classroom. And myself, I'm not English is my first language, and myself, I have to learn, Cree and Anishinaabe here in where I work, but a lot of the places, there's different types of Cree. When I was in Quebec, northern Quebec, just different variations of Cree. I think the Blackfoot language is really challenging to learn. I can't even really comprehend, I think, one word in Blackfoot, so I feel like the students are learning even at a higher level when I start to bring in our language, and I feel like science is just, it's the base there, but then there's a growing area to include in the classroom.
Rich. Andrea.
You bet. I'm going to try. Yeah, I'm going to try. So, and Claire can correct me. So this was it's taught to me through Bruce Flamont and Faye Maurice. As we were working through the Canadian Prairies Prescribed Fire Exchange, the elders all asked us to come ask the question in their language, and we had all the different language groups. So we had a team member learn how to ask in Cree, a team member learn how to ask in Dakota, and then my job was to learn in Michif. So na machi kishke tana lefu. So lefu is fire. Na maginon ka kishke tana tamak lefu. And that, so essentially, and let me tell you, it took a lot of work for them to try and even translate what I was asking back into a question. And so my understanding is that it is saying, we are here to learn about fire, and can you teach us about fire? But I don't even know if that's exactly, well, I know it's not exactly how it translates into English. And so it was really important. It was through also that same teaching of Roland Duquette through the engagement on fire, and Joseph Natauhau that said, like, you need to come ask us in our language, and that's been quite impactful. It was very important through folks who were out at the swale. You've seen the panels, you've seen the app. When we worked with the different language keepers to get that information, get language translation into those pieces, and a big part of that is that the language is being lost. And so our job is to light that fire, le feu, to reinstate that the best that we all can, I think, by connecting with the language keepers as best as we can and try and share that. And they want to. I think that was a really important thing. So just really high level in that between the OCAP principles and honoring these different elders and knowledge keepers, they want, so not all, they want to be recorded because they recognize the gap in knowledge, and they want to be able to share that, and specifically we make sure we have those permissions sought and that that's captured properly, and that they're very much acknowledged for those sharings and those teachings each and every time.
I'll just take a couple minutes. At our zoo, our integrating language into our work we're still pretty early on in our journey with that. So certainly within our interpretive elements, we're just now finishing up a whole brand new site-wide interpretive plan, which has really been quite extensive with working with Indigenous knowledge keepers, in particular Anishinaabe knowledge keepers, to ensure that the Anishinaabe language is integrated within our site. So certainly within the areas that are focused specifically on, local species, plants, animals, but just throughout our site. And that historically, we've had a program called Turtle Island Conservation Program that's been running for just over 15 years. And we had a knowledge keeper early on develop some beautiful materials in English, Anishinaabe, and Mohawk, and we still use those resources. One is a Ways of Knowing guide, which talks all about sort of integrating traditional knowledge and Western science, and then there are 2 storybooks, Walking with Mikwidezi and Walking with Anawara, the turtle, to tell a story. But that program has been very much kind of hived off and within a specific unit of the zoo. And so what we're looking to do is integrate more of that throughout the site. So not just in, the First Nations Knowledge Garden, but like everywhere. So that's definitely something that we're working towards, working closely with knowledge keepers and language holders, language speakers who are willing to share. And I think also, I just wanted to point this out, because I don't know if this is a thing with some of the science centers, but I know in a lot of the organizations that I've worked where they're sort of embarking on this journey of reconciliation and working in a better way with Indigenous communities, it's compensating knowledge keepers and language keepers appropriately for their time and their expertise and their knowledge is still a challenge, because there's still this sort of mentality of, we'll give you an honorarium. Well, an honorarium is not going to cut it. So part of that language piece and working with language keepers and knowledge holders is ensuring that they are properly supported with the knowledge and the energy that they are giving to us, so that it's not an extractive relationship. So whether it's definitely paying them properly, but also, ensuring that we help support them with their travel, food, just childcare if that's needed, grandchild care. So I just wanted to also make a comment on that, because language is so important, and the energy and the knowledge that's sort of transmitted through that process is quite significant. So that's where I'm going to leave it. So we have about 5 minutes left in our actual sort of formal panel piece. I don't know if we have room for another question, or if we want to just all kind of say a word to sign off, and then we can go into Q&A. Do you want to leave any parting words, Andrea? In 1 minute or less?
Well, just really fast, I think that, part of, I think, why we were asked to participate is it can be, not knowing where to start. And the best advice I can give you is that we're all relations, right? So reach out just like your best friend to your First Nation, Métis communities and governments, and go have a coffee and build a long-term relationship, and share where you're trying to go, and kind of don't let that intimidate you. I think collectively we can get at a lot of really important work here together.
Any final words?
I think, I see, I get a lot of questions is, a common question is, how do I, work with communities? And that involves, yes, our relationship building. You have to build that relationship. You have to build that trust. And, I myself, I'm a First Nation. I come from a community, but, I can't just walk into, any First Nation community in Canada and say, hey, I want to work with you, right? Like they would, just because I'm First Nation, I'm still not granted that, that opportunity. I have to work at that relationship, just like you will have to work with that relationship too. So yes, it's intimidating, and I understand, but you have to start to build that relationship and those connections and that trust with that community.
I would just like to say, Kanan Sculpton, I want to thank you all very much for inviting me here to speak today, and giving me this platform to speak about my experiences. I hope if you come away with anything from this experience, I hope that all of you truly remember to recognize how to spot absinthe. And I hope all of you remember the 5 reasons why it's such an awful plant.
Yes. That was very enlightening. That was a very enlightening experience. Yes, I was actually really amazed that absinthe was growing but I don't know why. I always associated it with France and those artists that would get terribly poisoned. Anyway, I digressed. Just wanted to say miigwech to everyone for giving us this space, an opportunity to share a little bit. And just sort of echoing what Dawn had said about not being afraid to build those relationships and connections. And if your heart and mind are in the right place, even if you make a mistake, it's all about where your heart and mind is at. And if you're ever in Toronto, for those of you that don't live in the area and want to come to the zoo, just drop me a line and we'll be happy to host you for the day or for part of the day. So thanks.
So we didn't find time for questions, but we're here all day. Find us and answer those questions, because we have to keep to time. I think folks have to eat lunch and move on to some other sessions. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, we want to give you an opportunity to have lunch and carry on conversations with our esteemed panel. And we'll see you back here at 11:30 for the Cascade Awards. Have a good lunch.